Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Hearing. I, for one, am delighted to see the hearing industry getting increasingly proactive about countering stigmatizing messages around hearing loss. Those include those ancient and ugly hearing aids from the 70s that still show up in mainstream media, portrayals of people with hearing loss as predominantly infirm, and a lack of representation in movies and TV commensurate with the prevalence of hearing loss at all ages. This isn't just a feeling, there's actually hard data. A recent YouGov survey in Australia found that 41% of Australians can't recall a single instance in the past year where they saw someone wearing hearing aids or cochlear implants in mainstream media, unless the content was specifically about hearing loss. They also found that 77% of Australians with hearing loss say media portrayals misrepresent them, often depicting them as elderly, fragile, or dependent, despite the fact that they themselves are aged 20 to 60, working, raising families, and so on. And also, over half of Australians say the lack of everyday media representation makes it harder for people to recognize hearing loss or seek help. We're going to get the perspective of an audiology clinic owner on how this affects the way people they see approach hearing loss. But first, I have with me Ceri Whittaker, Senior External Relations Manager at the GN Group, to learn more about what they are doing to counter this. Ceri, you facilitated several of my podcasts with GN people, but never been on yourself, so it's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank
Please,
you, Andy, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you here today.
it's my pleasure. Please tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
So, my name, as you say, I'm Ceri Whittaker. I'm a senior external relations manager in the hearing division of GN. I work in the communication team. I've been in the hearing aid business for over 20 years now. So, as I say, I'm very old in GN terms. Um, and recently, I've had the pleasure to be working on a couple of campaigns that we have put out, which are the original New Norm, which we launched at World Hearing Day 2 years ago, and now this new iteration, the New Norm 2.
Oh, thank you. So, because this time we're really talking about a data-based action, right? Tell us a little bit more about the survey and how it was conducted.
Absolutely. So we wanted to find out two things essentially. We wanted to see how often people see hearing loss represented in the general media and what impact that then has on how we think and how we behave. So we asked a number of questions. We asked people, when do you see hearing aids in the mainstream media? How are people with hearing loss presented? How does that impact your behavior and your perceptions of people with hearing loss? And we ran the survey across 3 countries. So you're absolutely right. It was in Australia, but we also ran the YouGov survey online in the UK and in the US as well. And we got very consistent responses across all 3 of those markets. We surveyed 3,000 people in total across the 3 markets. And of those, almost 1,000 of them were people who lived with hearing loss, or live rather with hearing loss. And that was really important for us because we wanted to get a good cross section of perspectives. We wanted people there with the lived experience, but we also wanted people who probably don't think about hearing loss very often, or maybe even at all, because we wanted to see how, even if you're not thinking about hearing loss, how the representation may affect how people behave and think.
Okay, and so it's interesting that you had 3 the survey was broken up into really several thousand people on 3 different continents, and yet you found that the results were very similar amongst all 3
Yeah,
groups.
very, very similar. Um, what we found actually was pretty startling. Um, as you said, in Australia, 41% of people couldn't name a single example from the previous 12 months of seeing a hearing aid, somebody wearing a hearing aid, or a cochlear implant in the media when the content wasn't specifically about hearing loss or hearing technology. And that figure was 41% in Australia. It actually rose to 49% in the UK and 55% in America. So they're pretty startling figures.
Absolutely, and you're getting this feedback from people without hearing loss too, so
Yeah.
they don't have a heightened awareness of this, and
Yeah.
and so when they say they haven't seen any representation, it really means something, at least to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And representation matters. It really does matter. Um, and what we found as well with people both with and without hearing loss was approximately 50% of people across those three markets, they believe that that lack of representation is making it more difficult for people to A, recognize themselves, and therefore, as a result of that, seek support.
And that makes perfect sense. It's if somebody doesn't realize how prevalent it is, they don't necessarily translate what they're experiencing to interpreting themselves as having hearing loss,
Yeah.
and because it's so hidden, it's not really top of their mind, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't see yourself, if you don't recognize yourself, then it's very difficult to recognize something in you. But on top of that, the other thing that we found was the same people we surveyed said that when there were stories about people with hearing loss, those portrayals were unrealistic or maybe even reductive. So, number one, they only saw people with hearing loss when the storyline or the narrative was specifically about hearing loss rather than just people living active everyday lives. And then when they did see that, those portrayals were they were often of people who were elderly, frail, dependent. So they were portraying actually a very narrow group of people. And that makes it harder for you to see yourself and to recognize yourself in that narrow group of people. And as I said, the knock-on effect of not recognizing yourself is it becomes more difficult to take action.
Or even if you do, since the portrayal is somebody who's, extremely old and infirm, I would create a negative reaction. I don't wanna look
Yeah.
like that person.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We all see ourselves as much younger than our chronological age, our actual age. We all think we behave, we look, you know, I'm, we all think we're a good sort of 20 years younger than we actually are. So you will not recognize yourself in that much older portrayal. But as I said, it's not just age. It's often quite reductive. It's linked through to frailty, to dependency, sometimes to confusion. So yeah, people just aren't seeing themselves.
And I've always felt that ageism in the
Mm.
workplace plays a role there too, because if you're a working person and this is how you believe people perceive others with hearing loss, are you going to want to advertise that
Yeah.
about yourself in the workplace?
Yeah, yeah, you are absolutely right. You really are.
And so then, how did you take those survey results and translate it into action? And obviously, the new norm version 2 is part of that. But version 2 is something different than version 1. So tell me what went into the thinking of version 2 and how version 2 is different.
It's well, if you like, I'll actually start with version one, and then I'll explain why we decided we needed to move that on, or rather to add to that. So, version one, the new norm version one, we launched 2 years ago on World Hearing Day, and we had a very, very specific purpose. So, we wanted to challenge the portrayal that you see in the mainstream media of hearing technology. And I'm sure that all of your viewers will be really familiar with this. You see an article in the paper, it gives great information about hearing health. It tells people that, sort of they need to address their hearing and this is how they can take action. And then it's illustrated with the photograph of someone who is old, possibly a little bit sad in the clinical environment, with a huge, great big banana on their ear. And those old, large, clunky, beige hearing aids just don't represent what hearing technology is now. And we wanted to do something to challenge that. It was something I've had so many conversations with audiologists, with people who wear hearing aids saying, but that's not what they're like. That's not true anymore. And that is actually putting people off from taking action. So we decided that we would create the new norm version one, and that was a free global image library. We had 30 images of just some absolutely beautiful images, which we made available via a royalty-free website, Unsplash, of people wearing their hearing aids. And it was really successful. We see those images all over the place. We've actually seen competitors use them, and I applaud them for doing so. We've seen those images all over the place. We know that they were viewed 11 million times on Unsplash. But when we look at this representation data, we decided we needed to move things forward. It's not just about representing the hearing technology, it's also representing the individuals who wear the hearing technology. So that's what we wanted to do with this new iteration, with the new Norm 2, was to take the hearing aids and the people out of the studio in those very beautifully lit but quite stylized shots and show people living with hearing loss and with hearing technology in their everyday lives. And that's what we've done. We've created another 60 royalty-free images, which are on that same platform on Unsplash. They're there, they're free for people to download. And they show individuals aged between 20 and 60 in their own environments. So in their homes, in their workplaces, out and about, socializing, but showing people as they live their lives to challenge that lack of what we see as true representation in the media.
I actually love that. I remember having a conversation. This was right before the pandemic, and I don't remember who. And I said, I'm driven so crazy by the big beige banana photos
Mhm.
that I'm going to take my camera out and shoot people, doing things. So I playing sport, so on and so on. Then pandemic, and you couldn't get with anybody, and I never got around to doing it. And then all of a sudden there was version 1 and then version 2 of the new norm now, and it's wonderful. I highly recommend it. People go, especially people in the media, go see the images, use those images, and lay the beige banana to rest. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm totally with you there. I mean, representation shapes how we think. It really does. Um, we want people to recognize themselves in the images that they see in the mainstream media. Um, and that is people living well with hearing loss and living ordinary, very possibly very dull lives with hearing technology. We want people to recognize themselves. We want to see the media and people within the industry creating more realistic storytelling around people with hearing loss. And in doing so, we're hoping that we can encourage more people to say, actually, yeah, that's okay. That's me. I recognize that. That's not scary. I can go and get support.
And how about the other half? And that is the lack of appropriate representation of people with hearing loss in movies and television and so on. How do you see GN being able to influence that?
That's a really good question. We are in conversations with some partners that we work with as to see that if there's anything that we can do maybe to call out some of that media. I can't promise that's what's going to happen. It's something we're talking about, but sort of we certainly do a lot of outreach. We did with the first new norm, and we're doing with this one to for example, photo libraries on newspaper desks, etc., drawing people's attention to this. And we are making these available to anyone. So anybody can download these images. There are no restrictions there. And I really would encourage people to go onto that website to view those images. If you need to do, you've got new campaigns, new websites, whatever. Those images are there, and as I said, they're freely available. So we would really encourage people to do that.
And I would love to see mainstream media do this, in movies and TV as well. I mean, there's some precedent. You, for example, worked with Han Kubenhaven on the fashion show, and so
Yeah.
now you're seeing two models who had hearing loss walking the runway and wearing their devices. Obviously, a highly visual and stylistic
Yeah.
environment. And, perhaps there are more partnerships with media companies that can help spread that message.
Absolutely, you're spot on there, and Andy. This is not something we're doing as a one-off. This is something that we really, really believe in. And as I said, we started this a little while back. We're continuing to revisit and refresh. Um, One of the GN, the main purpose is bringing people closer. And sometimes to do that, you have to remove some barriers. We really believe very passionately in what we're doing here, and we're not done yet. So we will continue to push this agenda and promote this agenda because it's something we all believe very, very strongly in.
Well, I, for one, really appreciate your efforts, as being one of those people who doesn't see themselves represented in the media.
Absolutely.
Um, so
Absolutely.
I really do appreciate everything you're doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next. Thanks a lot for spending some time and explaining it to everyone today. Now we're going to get the view of an independent audiology practice owner.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you as well for also sharing this, because you, I think, also have a very important role. In fact, I think everyone within the industry can take a role in challenging those misperceptions and changing the representation both of hearing technology and hearing people. I think we can all do it together. So thank you too.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And have a great day. We'll talk again soon.
You too. You too.
I have with me now John Lucchese. He's the founder of NS Audiology, hailing from Sydney, Australia. He's a long background in audiology, including music audiology. John, welcome to the show, and please tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me join you today. Um, well, yes, I'm the founder of NS Audiology. We're an independent hearing clinics in Sydney here. We've been in practice for 17 years. We conduct hearing and balance testing at our clinics, so we do the full gambit of audiological testing. Um, we have a very diverse clientele over the years. From, as Andrew was mentioning, my initial background was in music, so we have a lot of musicians that come to see us, but also too, we do pediatric testing as well. So the full gambit and spectrum of audiology.
Okay, and since we're talking about GN's New Norm program, let me ask you how you came to be involved in it and why is it important to you?
Well, I think initially, um, when we came to the industry, we sort of felt as though what's being portrayed in the industry in general didn't really, I guess, encompass the whole spectrum of clients that are affected by hearing loss. Obviously, and I think this is sort of the stereotype, is that it's for elderly clients and elderly members of society. But really, that spectrum is quite narrow-minded. It's quite a narrow view. So we hearing loss for all different reasons occurs through different stages of life. I think generally having that kind of thought process or understanding has meant that we haven't really fitted into what the industry saw as the norm of what the kind of client that would walk into an audiology clinic. From our perspective, we see younger people, we see people now that are more early adopters of technology for hearing protection and mild hearing losses. So the general sort of stereotype of what a person with hearing loss is, or the age of the person with the hearing loss is, I think is been something we've been trying to dispel for many years.
And then in terms of the outdated imagery that you're talking about, do you see that having an effect when people walk into the clinic? I mean, is that affecting their emotional response?
That's a really good question. Absolutely. I think people's preconceptions of what a hearing aid is quite outdated. When someone, I think, has that picture in their mind of what a hearing aid is, it's a big clunky device that's visually obvious, and probably even more so than that, it's not going to provide very much help and support in their daily lives. Whereas, just like in the changing world we live in, technology is something which is a great aid to us all. And I think the changes in technology, the integration of hearing devices with other, our mobile device, but our computers and our televisions, all these types of things, has actually meant that what people have in their mind's eye of what a hearing aid is and what they can actually do are vastly different.
And do you see that affecting their perception when they come to the clinic in a sense? Are you getting reactions, adverse reactions on account of the outdated perceptions? Is that causing people to hesitate because they don't want to appear like that outdated perception?
I definitely, well, in my experience, I think in 17 years practice, I've definitely seen a change and a shift. So first and foremost, when we started practice, I would say that was the almost everyone that walked into the clinic had that thought process that, it's a device which is going to make me feel or signal that I'm old, and have some health issue. Whereas over the course of the last particularly 10 years, but especially in the last 5 years or so, I think that's dramatically changed. Now, I think it's changed for a couple of reasons. I think in in general in the health industry, I feel that we're being much more proactive with our overall health. So addressing things earlier rather than waiting till they become a much greater problem. Um, and then as I said, with the benefits of technology, we're seeing younger people, but also, also a swathe of the proportion of the population nowadays are using some devices to help them with noise reduction, to be able to, stream their iPad, their iPhone, or their mobile phone directly into their ears when they're traveling. And so there are all these crossovers in different areas where there are these benefits that people have from integrating hearing devices into their everyday life.
Okay, so in your view then, this shift has already taken place or is already taking place, and the new norm campaign is really going to accelerate the trend that's already happening.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. I feel probably the missing link is possibly how hearing is there's 25% of the population in Australia that have hearing issues, and that's not accurately displayed when we see broadcasts on TV and movies and things like that. And I think that's one of the biggest sides of things, is that if we don't see it, we can't be it, and we can't accept it. And so having a greater prevalence of this being shown as being much more mainstream rather than niche, I think, as a lot of people see it as being, should completely dispel the rest of that kind of myth, as I said, from a technological perspective, but also too from a quality of life. But the more we see it as the norm, then I think, our preconceptions of what the devices are, and the sensation that they make me feel to others, or others feel about me in those scenarios, I think will be, yeah, absolutely, there'll always be a percentage of people that I think will still have that preconception. But if we can get that as low as possible, that should mean that hearing devices do become much more normalized.
Okay, so you've really said 2 things, right? Because the new norm campaign with the still images, especially the new ones, showing people, active in their professions or their hobbies, um, those are really to counter or to offer an alternative to the really outdated photos showing those ugly big beige bananas on an 80-year-old person's ear that print media still insists on using. But then
Absolutely.
you're also talking about for example, movies and other visual media, underrepresentation of people with hearing loss. Am I understanding
Correct.
that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel that, from print, it is something that if you ever do see hearing devices, out of I guess industry kind of advertising, it is that old preconception of a much older person, and a device which is visually uh, visually seen, and visually obvious. Um, and then I think just in mainstream sort of, digital media and television and movies and things like that, underrepresentation of hearing losses as a general percentage of the population, and the normal population.
Okay, so yeah, again, accelerating the trend you're already seeing by representing people, often enough so that it's more mainstreamed.
Absolutely, and that in itself will reduce that stigma, because when it's considered as being normal, then people won't have this sensation or this feeling that it means that I'm less than who I want to be or who I think I am. I think the other part that is working towards dispelling that is also the fact that, the adoption of some kind of hearing device, whether it be a hearing aid, well, I'm talking more of monitors and Bluetooth headsets and things like that, has become much more prevalent. So, and they're much more obvious than a hearing aid. So it's quite interesting. You see people walking around with those types of devices, and there's no hiding them. In fact, they're sort of displayed as almost a little bit of a trophy, is that I'm an adopter of technology, where hearing aids, particularly, you know, in comparison to those type of devices, are really invisible.
Yeah, right. It's an interesting point, especially depending on how you wear your hair. Like me with
Exactly.
my short hair, is very obvious I'm wearing these. Of course, the fact that they're red, it doesn't hurt either.
Well, you know, and that is something too. I think it's about being, I think people are more aware of if they can't have a conversation with you. So having, you know, the lovely red hearing aids, I think is showing that this is not something where I should have a stigma. And we do have a couple of clients that have, you know, said, "What's the loudest color you have in terms of a hearing device?" So that so I can be loud and proud, and also to not really well, I guess pushing back to a certain degree of that stereotype of what the limitations that hearing can have on someone's life, and that they don't necessarily need to, affect one's quality of life in the way that people believe it's going to.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. Listen, I really appreciate you spending some time. It's great to hear how you see all this playing out in the clinic, and that you find value in modernizing people's perceptions about hearing loss. So thank you very much for spending some time with me.
My pleasure, Andrew. It's been a lovely discussion, and look forward to catching up with you again at another conference some stage.
As do I. Looking forward to my next trip to Australia, whenever that is.
Lovely. Take care. Have a good day.
You too.